Hello everybody, I'm Daryl Pinksen. I'm the author of the 2008 book, Marlowe's Ghost, The Blacklisting of the Man Who Was Shakespeare. I first became interested in this topic in 2003 after seeing Mike Rubo's PBS Frontline documentary, Much Ado About Something. And that was my first exposure to the whole Shakespeare authorship debate. I knew very little about Christopher Marlowe, but one of the things that struck me as I was watching the video was the similarity between what was going on in London in the 1590s and what had happened to writers in Hollywood in the 1950s. And I mean, at that point, I had no plans to write a book. That happened a few years later. But when it did, that was the kernel around which the book kind of came together, was this idea of the blacklisted writer and how that worked in practice, because one of the main things that you come across when you discuss this idea with people is that, well, there's no way that this could work in practice. So in my book, one of the main things that I focus on is this idea of the blacklisted writer. And after the book was published, I wrote an article about this character that I came across named Philip Yordan. And I wish that I had come across him earlier, because his story I find very compelling, and it would have added a lot to the book if I had come across him earlier. But I'm going to read the article to you now. It's not too long, but I think it packs a nice punch. And the name of the article is Philip Yordan, a Modern Day Shakespeare. If Christopher Marlowe did not die at Deptford, but instead had been declared dead and went into hiding after 1593, then Shakespeare, as a partner in a theater company, a de facto producer, was in an ideal position to serve as the vehicle through which Marlowe's continued writing could reach the stage. This hypothetical scenario does have historical analogues, the best known example being the era of the Hollywood blacklist. In the 1950s, dozens of gifted writers were blacklisted because of real or perceived communist sympathies. Their previous work was not censored, but they could no longer get new work published. It was as if they'd professionally vanished. Many fled to Europe or Mexico, choosing exile to escape the repression. Many continued to write. It's what writers do. But they could no longer use their own names on their work. Fronts were used, men and women who passed blacklisted writers' work off as their own in exchange for, in most cases, the lion's share of the wealth and all of the credit. Since the 1960s, the Writers Guild of America has worked tirelessly to right these wrongs, but it has not been easy. In Marlowe's Ghost, I argued that Shakespeare, as a shareholder in the theater company that performed, among others, the plays attributed to him, used his position to act as a front for Christopher Marlowe's work. A writer I speculated had fled from prosecution and was in hiding. I also compared the political climate in London in the 1590s to Hollywood in the 1950s. Change the location and time, substitute atheist for communist, and a close parallel becomes apparent. In the 1950s, with the Cold War ramping up, domestic communists, conflated with atheism, were branded as enemies of the state. In Marlowe's day, with England under threat from continental Catholic Europe, those branded with atheism, never an entirely safe position in any age, provoked the same kind of visceral hatred. In the 1950s, dozens of writers had fled Hollywood, fearing imprisonment if they were subpoenaed. The political climate in Marlowe's day was similar. In 1593 London, a new law passed in Parliament authorizing search, seizure, and torture spurred Christopher Marlowe to warn his friend and fellow playwright Thomas Kyd to flee to Scotland. According to the Baines report, Marlowe was adamant that he would be leaving soon to go unto the King of Scots, and he was busy making the rounds of his literary friends, pressuring them to leave England as well to, in effect, get out while you still can. Of course, accused Hollywood communists' greatest fear was imprisonment. That was the least of Marlowe's worries. He, and those of like mind, could be tortured and executed, and many were. We now know that both Kyd and Marlowe were arrested before they had a chance to escape the repression. In Marlowe's Ghost, I argued, as others have before me, that the 1593 Deptford meeting between Marlowe and three associates in the English intelligence network, where it's reported that Marlowe was killed by one of these men, was actually a cover for Marlowe to escape perhaps of Scotland, with the assistance of master spy Robert Poley and other of the men at the Deptford meeting. In exile, Marlowe would have continued to write. That's what writers do, just as blacklisted writers did in the 1950s. But like those blacklisted writers, he would have needed a way to get his work into production. Shakespeare, in essence a 16th century theater producer, was perfectly positioned to bring play scripts to his company, claim them as his own, and share in the wealth from their production. The recognized anomalies of Shakespeare's biography, plenty of evidence of a business life in the theater, but little to no evidence of any literary life, save for his name on a collection of plays which, and this is not a controversial statement, echo the mind and work of Christopher Marlowe, could be explained with this scenario. This is an interesting theory, but could Shakespeare have actually gotten away with this? This is a major sticking point for those who dismiss the theory outright, that a conspiracy of this magnitude was just not possible. I think it was, and offer as a historical analog the career of Oscar-winning screenwriter-producer Philip Yordan, who was active during the era of the Hollywood blacklist. Much of our information about Philip Yordan's career as a screenwriter/producer comes from Bernard Gordon, a blacklisted writer employed and fronted by Yordan in the 1950s. Now, unfortunately, their two names rhyme. We have Philip Yordan, who's the credited writer, with dozens of works credited to him, and we have Bernard Gordon, who is the blacklisted writer accused of being a communist who couldn't get any work published during the years of the blacklist. So we have Yordan and Gordon. Despite working alongside Yordan for years, Bernard Gordon was never able to say for sure whether Philip Yordan was a brilliant and prolific writer or a complete fraud, or maybe something in between. Studio executives have been suspicious of the origins of Yordan's scripts during the blacklist years, and if the blacklist had not been broken, those suspicions would today only be familiar to a small number of Hollywood insiders. In Gordon's blacklist memoir, Hollywood Exile, he introduces Philip Yordan this way, quote, "For many years, Philip Yordan was the talk of Hollywood, regarded by some as a fraud, by others, including important stars and directors, as a genius. He amassed an improbable number of screen credits and seemed incredibly prolific." End quote. Yordan, whose name appears in the credits of a large and impressive body of films, was rumored to have employed uncredited writers. According to Bernard Gordon in Hollywood Exile, as a quote, "From 1944 until 1960, Yordan had a unique whirlwind career in Hollywood, principally as a writer, but also as a producer. He is credited officially with 50 to 60 screenplays and productions, an output that seems inordinate. For that reason, as well as others, he is widely said to have run a script factory. Of course, the same was said about the literary output of Zola and Dumas. Personally, I know of instances when Yordan put his own name on scripts that were written by blacklisted screenwriters, including my own. But there was real justification for that." End quote. Gordon was aware of the rumors, and while working for Yordan as a writer, was able to observe him up close for many years, helping to develop script ideas, discussing production problems like funding, locations, and casting, but he was never able to come to a decision about Yordan. Was Yordan the great writer that his screen credits lead us to believe? Did he write some of the scripts he is credited with? Did he write anything? In an interview with Patrick McGilligan for Tender Comrades, a backstory of the Hollywood blacklist, McGilligan puts it to Gordon outright. Quote, "Do you think he was once a great writer who decided to channel his energies into business and promotion? Or is he one of Hollywood's greatest hoaxes as a writer, someone who never actually wrote?" End quote. Clearly uncomfortable answering the question, since Yordan had employed Gordon while Gordon was blacklisted and had paid him well, while other blacklistees' careers were in ruins. Gordon answers, quote, "Look, I can't answer that question, and I don't want to answer that question. I don't want to make a judgment. I consider him a friend. It's not possible for me to say what he did during his better days. When he was writing scripts for important directors and producers, I can't believe he was incapable of writing a good scene or a good script. He must have been, but I didn't see it." End quote. During years of working together on films, while Yordan sold many scripts to Hollywood with his name on them as writer, Bernard Gordon never saw Yordan write anything. Gordon did, though, see Philip Yordan put his name on scripts which he did not write, including his own. Suppose now for a moment that the Hollywood blacklist had never been broken, and the label communist still induced a revulsion similar to that felt toward atheists in the Elizabethan period. If Bernard Gordon had never been unblacklisted, he would never have gotten Hollywood Exile published and would never have been interviewed by Patrick McGilligan about his experience as a blacklisted writer. As the years passed, and the studio heads' skepticism of Philip Yordan faded with them from memory, all that would remain of Philip Yordan would be his name on dozens of films as writer. Those credits would be cited as unassailable proof of Yordan's contribution to 20th century screenwriting. Was Philip Yordan a fraud? Bernard Gordon doesn't want to believe it, but that may have more to do with Yordan's impressive capacity for secrecy and Gordon's gratitude than the truth. The case for Marlowe's authorship of Shakespeare's plays is currently unprovable. That's one thing that I've kind of resigned myself to, and the example of Philip Yordan, I think, brings that case home. It's impossible to prove whether or not Philip Yordan wrote all of those scripts that he's credited with, and this is something that only happened in the 1950s in an era when we had modern media. Like there were recording devices, there's films, there's all kinds of ways to substantiate claims. But even now, that is impossible to discern. But we can still make a judgment about what is most probable. And I think it's most probable that Philip Yordan probably didn't write any of the good works that that he's credited with. Maybe he wrote some stuff earlier on, before the blacklist hit, but after that, he just focused on producing. Well, here's my conclusion. If Philip Yordan could have gotten away with a deception of this magnitude in the 1950s, William Shakespeare could have gotten away with a similar deception in the 1590s. That doesn't mean it happened, but it is certainly plausible. And anytime somebody says, well, this is an impossible scenario that you're proposing, that Marlowe wrote Shakespeare, this is something that I come back with and tell them, well, no, there is actually an analogy that we can refer to, and here's how it would have happened in actual practice. Well, folks, thanks so much. I want to thank the Marlowe Society for inviting me to contribute today, and I hope you have a great conference. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.